Welcome to History 354, Modern China. Today's topic is the pressure and challenges China faced in the 1980s as a result of explosive population growth in the 20th century. As you read in Chapter 25 from Spence, despite the success of the CCP's early economic reforms and the opening of the economy, China was threatened by a host of new challenges. Localism, the complexity of China's administrative system, and competing interests and visions slowed down development and the implementation of policy, evidenced by the decades-long project that encompassed the building of the Three Gorges Dam along the Yangtze River. China's educational system, which was ravaged by the Cultural Revolution, struggled to recover and produce enough college graduates and technically trained specialists in many areas, especially the badly needed field of law. Once effectively banned as private practice, the new style economy that Deng Xiaoping was trying to build demanded legal specialists equipped to handle matters on tax, private property, inheritance, and especially international law. Faced with these challenges, conservatives called for retrenchment and caution, while optimistic reformers such as Zhao Ziyong urged the nation to, quote, not fear prosperity, end quote. There was no issue, though, that represented the potential pitfalls of prosperity than the crisis China faced from population growth. To cope with the threat of a population of 1 billion, negating economic growth and creating strains on the nation's resource, the CCP would institute a policy known as the one-child policy, only recently phased out a few years back. In terms of its aims, dramatically slowing China's population growth and reducing the size of the average family were an incredible success engineered by the one-child policy that likely spared the nation the fate that befell many of its neighbors in Asia, such as India. And yet the means by which China slowed down its population growth was incredibly controversial, relying many times on extreme uses of governmental power that intruded into the home and violated the human rights of ordinary Chinese families. The impact of both the one-child policy and population pressures on women, especially in the 1980s, speak to the ways in which the nation's new challenges and reformist values often ask Chinese mothers, daughters, and young women in the workforce to undergo great sacrifice. In this lecture, then, we are going to explore a few of the major consequences felt by women in this particular generation that were caused by China's need to address the threat of rampant overpopulation. Okay, backing up for a second, it was apparent in the 1980s that if not for aggressive action, all of the gains in economic development under Deng's reforms would soon be consumed by the citizens of China themselves. A census in 1982, the first truly accurate, precise, systematic study of the population undertaken by the communists in power, showed that China was now home to over 1 billion people, although that number also includes Taiwan, Macau, and Hong Kong. Despite the enormous loss of life during the Maoist era, 1 to 2 million landlords killed during the initial periods of peasant mobilization, 20 to 30 million lost to the Great Leap Forward, and additional millions destroyed by the Cultural Revolution, there was no dip in the size of the overall population of China as there had been with the disasters of the Ming Dynasty. This speaks to their efforts and success in Beijing to raise the standard of living, improve education, diet, and healthcare that all mitigated the damage done by Mao's erratic programs and the persecution of his class enemies. But now, for a number of reasons, including the increased life expectancy of Chinese citizens, 20th century China was threatened to find itself the victim of its own success and fall into a Malthusian trap. Mao rejected the concept in the 1950s and 1960s, instead looking at population as a source of national strength and a vital resource to be tapped by the state to develop. The idea that a population could balloon and rub against the limits of its food supply, its resources, and in later conceptions of Malthusian theory, things like jobs and opportunity, and cause strife or war, was seen as a false flag, something designed to trick China and third world nations into halting the production of its greatest asset in the struggle against already developed nations and superpowers like the United States. With Mao gone and his ideology repudiated by the party at the Third Plenum, it was safe to acknowledge the reality that China's population put the nation on the precipice of another disaster in the early 1980s, if not the near future. Worse, the environmental damage unleashed by rapid industrialization, the increasingly worsening ratio of arable land to people per capita, and the overcrowding of cities conjured visions of endemic poverty and internal conflict now and forever on the horizon, if this problem wasn't solved. The reforms would not be able to create growth that could keep pace with the size of Chinese families, which in the 1960s and 1970s averaged 5 or 6 children. The result was a complex system of education, family planning, and a mixture of incentives and severe punishments known as the one-child policy. Announced by Hua Guofeng and the National People's Congress, the one-child policy initially called for families to voluntarily restrict the size of their families and take other measures designed to slow the rate of population growth, such as marrying later in life or allowing for greater intervals between the children. Already by the early 1980s, the distribution of birth control devices and educational campaigns urging smaller families were working. Female fertility fell from 4.2% to 2.2% in a period from around 1974 to 1980. But it wasn't enough, and resistance to the one-child policy sparked more aggressive measures. Conventional Chinese culture looked upon a big family, as a sign of good fortune, blessing, bliss, and status. But there were also incentives in a nation rapidly industrializing to look at a big family as the means to find security through bringing more earners into the home, basically more people to make a wage, to work in factories, to find income. Soon, the CCP was aware that over 1 million families who already had between 5 or more children had given birth to new infants. The result was that Beijing decreed compulsory IUD insertions and sterilizations for millions of men and women. Families that adhered to the one-child policy would be rewarded with benefits and housing and education. More comprehensive punishment was used for those that wouldn't comply. Heavy fines, forced abortions, and the loss of jobs and social benefits. The intensity with which the CCP pursued the issue suggests the party saw this as a threat or a challenge that superseded all those others it faced in the 1980s. It also suggests a paradox, right? It shows us how the rule of the CCP and its reforms were efficient and sometimes progressive, very much looking to the long-range future of the country, and yes, also still reliant on authoritarian measures to implement these reforms and the use of great violence against its own people to force conformity with the CCP's decision-making. Over time, the one-child policy achieved its desired result. Estimates show that as many as 4 million births were likely prevented in a first decade or so through various measures of the one-child policy. But there were also great resistance from Chinese families and periodic condemnation from the international community. Other families adapted, and as Spence mentioned, new conventions for honoring family and incorporating the and for adapting to the circumstances of the one-child policy were developed, like the honoring of abortions and gift-giving for different rites of passage. Critics, though, included the new network of Christian missions operating inside the PRC, People's Republic of China once again. Not officially as missionaries, but now inside China as teachers, scientists, aid workers, and physicians, and they use their presence and knowledge of the one-child policy to raise awareness outside of China. Others, such as non-governmental organizations or NGOs, highlighted the use of violence and intimidation to enforce the measures, or at least criticized the program as a violation of people's human rights and freedom of choice. International institutions and world leaders often kind of took a softer approach, encouraging China to continue its efforts at population control without resorting to such extreme measures of enforcement. From the vantage point of the CCP, though, the party, the risk was too great to the overall health of the country to not vigorously enforce this. But pressure from below over time forced the CCP to adopt a number of revisions, allowing for exceptions for ethnic minorities in Xinjiang in the southwest. There were also those that questioned whether or not the one-child policy was actually necessary. For one, the greatest declines in fertility rates actually came in the 1970s through education and the spread of cheap, accessible birth control. And when one studies the history of Asia and urbanization in this period, you can also see that in neighboring countries like South Korea, Japan, and the Philippines, as urbanization increased, the size of Asian families falls quite dramatically in the latter half of the 20th century. In much of Asia, then, there appears to be a strong link between lower fertility rates and the expense and challenges of raising children in urban environments. As China's urbanization continued, you could question, would fertility rates have fallen without such an expansive use of state power, like it did in those neighboring countries? That's one question that we can ask about the one-child policy. We can also consider how the population question and one-child policy impacted a generation of women that faced new expectations and demands concerning their roles as mothers, daughters, and just generally members of society. And for women, it was a unique time. China in the 1980s was a young and vibrant society. Much of that youthful energy was female. The census showed in 1982 that 60 million women recorded were in their 30s, 80 million in their 20s, and another 125 million plus that were even younger than that. Moreover, they were women who formed women who were formed, meaning they grew up and had a background shaped and molded in an entirely different milieu than many of their mothers and grandmothers had ever experienced. They were born into a socialist society, where women were theoretically liberated from conventional gender roles. They were expected now to be educated, politically active and conscious, and socially equal to men. They expected to choose their own marriage partners and aspired to things like being a politician, a cadre, factory workers, and saw themselves as patriots. The grim reality, though, of life in the People's Republic of China for many of these women never met that standard. Instead, many talked in the 1980s about their experiences as women using the popular idiom of 吃苦, or eating or chewing bitterness, to describe how women were forced to stomach continued exploitation and discrimination, even as mainstream culture and the media extolled the idea that women enjoyed complete fulfillment, respect, and equality. The reality for many women set in first in the family, where sons continued to receive preferential treatment from their mothers and fathers. From the early 20th century to the last quarter, there's actually little change in the expectations and performance of household labor for women. Within middle class and urban families, chores such as housekeeping and cooking were still done primarily by women. And in rural areas, women still worked very hard inside the home and outside in the fields. Most of the family's resources then were still invested in preparing male sons for success via education or purchasing other opportunities in the economy. In adulthood, though, those lessons for women became even more harsh and disappointing and discongruous with the socialist utopia they were supposed to be living in. The workplace was still segregated, with women relegated to areas of manufacturing that paid less and had far less social prestige. Even more interesting, when their careers produced a chance for higher paying positions and promotions, a surprisingly large number of Chinese women actually turned down these opportunities. If you read why that was this week, shoot me an email with an answer and I'll give you some extra credit towards your final exam or your final score in the course. Okay. Women rose in the party ranks, but most often hit a hard ceiling that kept them in largely ceremonious or symbolic positions of power. Only one woman by the 1980s had managed to reach the Politburo, Qian Zhenying. Although it should be noted that inside China, women's representation in government often surpassed percentages that you could find in other nations, including many democratic countries like the United States. But these women were also in positions where they were in service of an authoritarian regime. Lastly, there was also the fact that for many women, the Danwei essentially became a second patriarchal figure in their lives. And I'm going to pick up here in the next video.